I'm Shaun Haney, and this is RealAg on the Weekend. Let's get real and get connected with the week that was in Canadian agriculture. RealAg on the Weekend starts now. Welcome to RealAg on the Weekend. I'm your host, Shaun Haney of RealAgriculture.com. It is great to be with you here on today's program. Hope you had yourselves a great week. And we are the middle of June. Look at that. Just like that. Wow. And wow. What a week. Now, a lot of times in the broadcasting business, hosts and guests will be like, oh, what a week. I don't know how we're going to get to all of it. Think about all the things that have happened and all that's underway. And yeah, that's true. This felt like a week in agriculture. Big time. Big time. It was a real whirlwind. And whether it's on the biofuel front or it's on the political front or you think about the geopolitics, yikes. Scary stuff in kind of big, anytime I hear, Israel and Iran are shooting at each other, it does sort of, whether you know the depths and the details of all of it, you're kind of uncomfortable with it. I did have a friend on the weekend a friend on Friday that had said to me, like, there's a heavy weight to this. Heavy weight. And that's pretty accurate description indeed. Today on RealAg on the Weekend, well, hey, I do want to mention, before we get to the lineup, I would encourage you to go to RealAgriculture.com, especially in a week like this. We are loaded with details, information, and insight to help you in your farm business. And can't get it all on this show. We squeeze in as much as we possibly can. But you got to go to RealAgriculture.com to get the full details. You go wherever you get your podcasts. You can download the RealAg Radio podcast. You can also find all of the plethora, the abundance, the richness, whatever words you want to use, of all of the agricultural content that we have that is put up via podcast or on the Real Agriculture YouTube channel. There also is the RealAg newsletters, and you can subscribe to those free newsletters by going to realagriculture.com/subscribe. Okay, today on the program, we're going to dive in on looking at the smoke that has, I'm in Lethbridge, Alberta. So it's in and out. But I'll tell you, we've had some brutal smoky days this week from some of these wildfires. Consequently, the wildfire situation also has caused the Fed-Prov territory agriculture meeting that was scheduled for a couple weeks from now. Well, no, actually, about a month from now in Winnipeg has been canceled due to the wildfires. It was going to happen in Winnipeg. Of course, Manitoba has been really struck and hit hard. A lot of people displaced and being put into hotel rooms. And due to the wildfires, they're pushing it off. We'll have to see what they say in terms of a reschedule. But it's not happening in Winnipeg here in a month. So that impact of the smoke, and of course, the biggest issue is the fact that people are having to evacuate. Okay, so number one. But what are the agricultural impacts of that smoke that's hanging in the air? And based on the dry bias that we're seeing in Alberta and Saskatchewan, what's the outlook for that smoke through the rest of the summer? This could hang with us for the rest of the summer, in and out, depending on what the weather pattern is, right? What's the impact on crops? What is the impact on weather patterns? Okay, so there's things like how does it impact photosynthesis? There also is, hey, what's the impact on herbicide efficacy? We've covered that on RealAgriculture.com. But what about the impact it has on weather patterns? We're going to hear from Matt Makens of Makens Weather about that. We're going to hear from Shari Laventure of SaskAg Matters, talking about they're looking for some assistance, some help to make sure that there's adequate resources in Saskatchewan when it comes to farmers having access to mental health specialists, especially in times like this where there is drought, market volatility. For sure, we're going to talk to Shari Laventure about that. We got Yarnell of BASF to talk about some impacts of diseases in dry years. And then we've also got Turkington. He's going to talk about some of the stripe rust risk that prairie wheat growers do face here in 2025. Now, if you have any feedback on today's show, we'd love to hear from you. You can send me an email, shaney@realagriculture.com. You can also call the RealAg feedback line, 855-776-6147. Okay, let's get to Matt Makens. What's the impact this smoke has on weather patterns?
The smoke, sadly, based on the weather pattern, is likely it's going to be summer long. Okay. Unless we can do something about the fires, the weather pattern is getting locked into what it wants to do for the rest of summer, basically by now or next week. Okay. So we're going to keep this perpetual flow of smoke, and it's going to hit Saskatchewan. It's going to hit Manitoba. It'll drift into the northern U.S. And the bigger that and more stagnant, if you will, this plume of all this smoke, there will become regional and larger climate impacts. The bigger that plume gets, you begin to alter temperature patterns, especially at the surface, and you can alter precipitation patterns. And I'll break that down a little more specifically here. So if the more smoke you add to the air, okay, when you bring in clouds or humidity, when you're trying to develop rain, any sort of rainfall, that humidity in the air likes to grab a salt particle, any mineral, or it will cling to dust, or in this case, it'll cling to smoke particles. And then it builds a raindrop around this. If your air is clear, the process, if you will, happens one way. But if you fill it with smoke, now you're altering how we're forming the precipitation. Maybe that impacts the overall magnitude of how heavy the rainfall is or how far it spreads out, those kinds of things. Now, when it comes to temperatures, if you're building this blanket of wildfire smoke, underneath that, perpetually, day after day after day, that land mass is not getting as hot as it otherwise would.
Right.
So that has a global system impact to it as well. So yes, absolutely. A small fire, not much. But as you add more and more smoke, and we're talking, the size of a province, and then we add 3-4 provinces worth of smoke, then yes, you do get these impacts, and they will go downstream. Absolutely.
Wow. Okay. So what does it tell us then? How does that at all impact some of the things you told us earlier about the forecast, or did you factor that smoke into it?
Today, and really since April, the wildfire smoke has been an element into the forecast that I produced. When we spoke at CattleCon in February, we'd kind of briefly mentioned, the wildfires are probably going to be bad again this year, just because the snowpack probably isn't there. So it wasn't really a factor then. So the forecasts for the summer were hotter. But as we hit March and April, it was clear we were not getting the amount of snow late in the season to help this situation. So then, the weight of the wildfire impactor did grow in the forecast process. Yes.
That was Matt Makens of Makens Weather. You can hear that whole interview on his entire North American forecast by going to RealAgriculture.com. We'll be back here on RealAg on the weekend right after this.
Co-op Ag's own bin logic is the ultimate tool for ensuring the success of your grain operation. Simple, scalable, solar-powered, and cost-effective, BinLogic lets you monitor your bins from anywhere. Contact your co-op equipped team member to learn more.
Hi, I'm Bernard Tobin, host of the Soybean School on RealAgriculture.com. Throughout the year, on the Soybean School, we'll bring you timely agronomic video content from planting to harvest, from the latest agronomic research to the latest in production technology. Check out our massive video library on YouTube, RealAgriculture.com, or download the audio podcast versions wherever you get your podcasts. The Soybean School is brought to you by Mazak Seeds and Lalamon Plant Care.
If you're serious about agriculture, RealAg's got you covered.
For over 10 years, we've listened to and shared what producers have to say about everything from policy to agronomy from coast to coast.
Keep up with the latest in Canadian agriculture at realagriculture.com through daily newsletters, and check out our YouTube channel.
Thanks for joining us in the RealAg community as we continue to cover and serve North American agriculture.
If you're involved in the agriculture industry, it's important to stay informed on all the latest issues affecting your business. At RealAgriculture.com, we offer fast, reliable news, information, and insights to help you keep on top of all of the latest in Canadian agriculture. Visit RealAgriculture.com and sign up for our free daily newsletter covering everything from news, agronomy, animal agriculture, and much more. Visit RealAgriculture.com/subscribe today.
Joining us right now on Real Agriculture is Shari Laventure with SaskAg Matters. Shari, how are we doing?
We're doing great, Shaun. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. Okay, so for people in the audience that don't know what SaskAg Matters is, what's your objective?
Our objective is to have accessible, free mental health supports that are timely, that are given by ag knowledgeable therapists, and that work with the timeline of our Saskatchewan producers. So essentially what we do is we get donations from private business, some private people as well, and then we coordinate through our SaskAg Matters website for 6 hours of free therapy a year for ag producers.
Okay, and I guess how long has the program been in place?
So it started out of research. So back in about 2018-19, Dr. Michelle Pavlov started some research on what supports egg producers are currently using and were they effective. And we heard loud and clear from that research. We interviewed a number of growers in Saskatchewan, and we heard time and time again, it's too travel too far to get therapy. The therapist doesn't understand my business, so I spend most of my session explaining what I do, whether it's ranching, farming, whatever that is. And so we wanted to create something specifically to what they asked for. So that's where SaskAg Matters came about. We've been running for about 2 years now, operating and giving services.
And do you have enough resources to handle the capacity of demand that's out there for a service like this?
Yeah, I wish we could say we're safe, but we're not. We do have some funds in our bank account, but depending on the seasonality, and we really see like now there's drought in a big chunk of Saskatchewan, which is daily becoming worse, right? So we're starting to see a real uptick in producers reaching out for help, which is a catch-22, right? That's what you want it to be there for, but then you also know, oh, they're in a not a good space right now.
Yeah, that's I don't like that. That's not good. Like, and it tangibly it does make sense.
Yep.
There are some reasons to be optimistic, but even when we're in good times, that doesn't mean that there's not a need for something like this. It's not always like, hey, bad financial situation means, an uptick in the people, the amount of farmers that would need a service like SaskAg Matters. It can also happen in good times as well. We can't drop our guard on that.
No, 100%. And I'll give you a little background story about myself and how I became involved with this. In 2015, my younger brother was a farmer and a rancher. He had cattle and grain. And he had the world by the tail. He had no financial troubles. He had a wonderful fiance. He had a great family. He was doing vacations. To the outside world, he had everything, but he didn't have his mental health. And we got the terrible call as a family that he decided to end his own life. So this to me was like a big shining red flag that, if it can happen to him, it can happen to anybody. And sometimes the happiest person in the room is the one we need to be watching out for and checking in with.
Yeah. If there's people out in the audience, whether you're in agriculture or out of agriculture and you're listening to this conversation, how do people support SaskAg Matters and get involved and try to make a difference on this front?
Yeah, so we are run by a volunteer board. So all of the funds that get sent to SaskAg Matters go directly to supports for the ag producer and their families. So there's a little bit of advertising that we do in there. There's a little bit of merchandise that we do in there, but I'm going to say 98 cents on the dollar goes directly to farmers and their mental health therapy sessions. So we're calling out that we need funds to continue to offer this service. We need some funds. So there's several ways that people can donate. They can go on the SaskAgMatters.ca website, and there's actually a donate button there. They can e-transfer to SaskAgMatters@gmail.com, or they can mail a check to 105 Cooper Cove, RM of Aberdeen. All that information, if they need it, is on the website. So if they didn't have a chance to write it down, they can just go to our website and they'll see all of that info there.
That is great stuff. Shari, thanks so much for joining us here today. Really appreciate it.
Yes, thanks so much, Shaun.
You know, this kind of programming, super critical. I don't care if you're in Saskatchewan, Alberta, Ontario, or you're in Alabama. It doesn't really matter. We got to have programs like this that farmers have access to if there is something that is, bothering them, there's something not right. And we shouldn't have to wait till things escalate to to the worst case scenario before people are like, man, jeepers, what could we have done? Well, what you could have done is, obviously there's things related to that individual. There's also broad-based things you could do from a support perspective too. So appreciate Shari Laventure coming on the program here and talking about SaskAg Matters. Every province has like programs like this, and if you don't, you need to. I think it's one of the things that the industry needs for sure. There's lots of different resources out there, lots of different ways to go. But the more accessible and easier it is for people to to participate in programs like this, all the better, indeed long term. On our Canadian Farmer Sentiment Index, we have been asking producers across Canada, on the state of their mental health relative to 12 months ago. And it's been encouraging that with all of the volatility, with all of the things that are happening, I mentioned at the beginning of the show about the news cycle, how viciously volatile it has been, harder and harder for farmers to steer through some of this and try to make sure that they're financially and from a legacy standpoint and from a farming standpoint, they're on the other side of it. And there is an opportunity to make money. There's also the opportunity to not. There's always an opportunity not to make money. That goes with entrepreneurship, period. But there's just a lot of variables that are out of the farmer's control. Now, there are risk mitigation programs. I'm a big proponent of, I think, we need to get more formal risk management plans out in the marketplace. Not enough farmers are thinking, they're aware of the risks. They're also aware of the benefits if they had more formal risk management plans. But we still have a gap there. And so that's something I personally feel, just try to help out in any way I can to help producers get past that or just improve what you have, right? There's always room for incremental improvement when it comes to your strat plan, operational plan, and for sure your risk plan. And 68% of Canadian farmers believe that 2025 is riskier than 24. It's substantial. And the question is, what are you doing about it? Because that added risk can really create some stress. It really can create some stress. And so it's really, really upon us to ensure that we're doing everything we possibly can to help out. So check out SaskAg Matters or any of your provincial groups that do programs like this. We're right back on RealAg on the weekend right after this. Want to stay on the leading edge of farm management? RealAgriculture.com features the Mind Your Farm Business podcast brought to you by RBC Royal Bank. Find it at mindyourfarmbusiness.com or wherever you get your podcasts. RealAg Radio is Canada's only daily radio show focused on agriculture. Get expert advice on Agronomic Monday. Tuesdays and Wednesdays will cover a broad range of issues. Thursday we'll hear from farmers across the country on the Farmer Rapid Fire. And we'll wrap things up Fridays with the RealAg Issues panel with Kelvin Hefner and Lindsay Smith. Join us Monday through Friday at 4:30 Eastern, and don't forget about the replay at 7 in the morning on Rural Radio 147, Sirius XM. Get all the information you need to keep your pulse crop healthy and profitable with the Pulse School on RealAgriculture.com. The Pulse School is a free YouTube video series covering agronomy, research, and more across a host of different pulse crops. It's also available as an audio podcast wherever you download or stream your favorite podcast. Check us out on YouTube or visit RealAgriculture.com. The Pulse School, brought to you by BASF Canada. It's a bit of a dry year this year on the Western Canadian prairies. And sometimes we make the assumption that we've got to have wet weather in order to have disease issues. Now, one of the diseases where the timing of that moisture is everything, okay, is Sclerotinia in canola. And our recent canola school, now you can find out more about our canola school that we do at Real Agriculture. It is sponsored by BASF and Vigor Hybrid Canola. Go to canolaschool.com and you'll see all of the episodes that we do. We also send out a newsletter about canola-related content. And here's the other part of it. You can download the podcast, too. If you just want to listen to the audio while you're driving through the field, you are more than welcome to do that as well. Lots of ways to connect with realagriculture.com content all the time. Okay, so in our recent canola school, Amber Bell of Real Agriculture talked to Lori Yarnell of BASF and talked about dealing with Sclerotinia issues in dry years. Let's hear the conversation.
Here today for an episode of Canola School with Lori Yarnell, who's a technical marketing manager with BASF. And we're going to be talking about Sclerotinia, but we're going to really break that down. We're going to talk about what happened last year. For sure. Because last year was a different experience, I think, for a lot of growers. So let's go into a couple of the stories that you guys heard from growers. You know, what were we seeing?
Yeah, so last year, it was the first year of moisture for a lot of areas after a lot of years of drought. And I know going into 2024, there was a lot of talk of, is the inoculum even there anymore? After so many years of drought, we know that sclerotia, the resting bodies that overwinter in the soil, are supposed to last for 10 plus years. But would those populations be low enough that even if we had the right conditions, that Sclerotinia would show up? What we learned is, yes, they were there. They were there indeed. That especially in Manitoba, I know the northeast central areas of Saskatchewan had a lot of Sclerotinia pressure last year. You can see that just from stories that we're hearing from our growers and some regrets on not spraying fungicide. But hearing that despite the drought, pressure was there. So I think that's a big lesson that we learned is, hey, even if we've had years of drought, we know the pathogen's there, and if conditions return to having moisture in June and July, that the disease will show up.
Right, and how important is that to consider going into the season for growers? You know, okay, it's really dry right now. We're doing pretty well without too much rainfall. So how important is that to know going into the season when you're making your plans?
I think it is important to know that the disease is there. When we really need to start looking at moisture and whether we need a fungicide to help control Sclerotinia is going to be in that window about 2 weeks prior to flowering. That last year, for example, once again going to lessons from 2024, we had a really wet June across a lot of the prairies, and then the taps turned off for July in a lot of areas. But I think because it was so wet in June, the Wunsch lab at NDSU down in North Dakota has showed that the biggest indicator of pathogen, of the sclerotia germinating, creating apothecia, having those spores present, is prolonged moisture. So if those 2 weeks before flowering, if the soil is consistently wet, that's really going to allow the pathogen to create those spores and be present at flowering. So if that timing before flowering is really wet and really has that prolonged soil moisture, it's going to increase your risk of Sclerotinia. And I think last year, with the taps turning off and not having that rain in July, probably a lot of growers thought, oh, not raining, don't need to worry about sclerotinia. But we saw that with that wet June, we had really dense canola crops and a lot of moisture in that soil that despite it not raining, that moisture is trapped in the canopy, creating that microclimate in the canopy where there's still moisture, still humidity. I know talking to my family last year in Manitoba that despite it not having rained for 2 weeks, you still can't mow your lawn until the afternoon, right? That there's so much moisture in the soil, in the ground, in that canola canopy that despite it not having rained for a while, the moisture's there to really still have disease.
And how much disease incidence is almost too much? Like at what point is it like, hey, last year, there was just a bit. Yeah. Should you be worried about it this year?
Yeah. So there's a handy calculation that looks at incidence. Incidence being the number of plants infected. So for every point incidence, you're losing about half a point of yield. So if you have 10% incidence, 1 in every 10 plants infected, you're losing about 5% of your yield. So depending on what your yield potential's looking like, that can really factor into kind of what percentage does it give you that ROI to spray. Unfortunately, the conditions where your yield potential looks really good, you have that dense canopy, lots of vegetation, lots of moisture, that's also the conditions that you're generally going to see disease. So when we have the conditions that your canola crop's looking good, it's that much more important to protect that yield potential.
Right. And so a fungicide's important if you're concerned about it. But are there any other strategies that growers can use to kind of mitigate some of the risk?
I think a big one is planting the correct crop density, that we don't want a really, really, really tight canopy, that trying to aim for that 5 to 7 plants per square foot, I believe it is, that correct plant density at the beginning of the season is something we can do now. I guess the plants already are popping out of the ground for a lot of Western Canada, so maybe a little late for this year.
Plan for next year.
But plan for next year of having that correct density of plants. And then if conditions are looking good, especially that time leading up to flowering, as well as at that flowering timing, spraying a fungicide is going to be your best option. Unfortunately, by the time you see disease, it's too late. That by the time we're seeing those infections, it's too late to spray. So really, it's looking at the conditions that we have leading up to flowering, at flowering, that's really going to inform our management decisions for the year.
Great. And any words of encouragement for growers as we go into this growing season?
Yeah, we never know what the year is going to throw at us. And moisture, it's a good problem to have, right? That if we're having that moisture, to have that dense canopy, to have disease conditions, we know that the yield potential's there. So let's hope for a return to average moisture again this year across the prairies.
That was Lori Yarnell speaking with Real Agriculture's Amber Bell. And, put well, yeah, let's hope we get back to some normal conditions. In that full forecast that I did with Matt Makens from this week's RealAg Radio podcast, you got to listen to it. I'll be honest with you, we're kind of locked in a bit of this dry bias. I have a feeling that I didn't like what Matt was telling me, and Matt's a great meteorologist. Okay, he's one of the best. I love chatting with him. But concerning stuff. We're just not in that weather pattern where we're going to have this abundance of moisture. And the more I talk to producers, the more I'm hearing concern about it's the timing of it, right? So we can be really light on moisture. But if we get the showers at the right time, just like an inch here, half an inch there, it can surprise you what we can do. The problem is the timing is so critical. It's feast or famine. I'm telling you, the old weather lottery. Let's take a break. We've got more Real Ag on the weekend coming up right after this. Don't miss out on any of the content that RealAgriculture.com publishes. Whether you're looking for agronomy, current events, or industry news, our daily newsletters bring you the most current information every morning. Visit RealAgriculture.com/subscribe.
The Canola School on RealAgriculture.com is a video series that showcases the latest in canola research and production agronomy. Learn from some of the best at your own pace through quick and timely producer-focused videos available on our YouTube channel. The Canola School on RealAgriculture.com is the quickest way to keep up to date on all the latest in canola production. Boost your canola IQ with the Canola School, brought to you by BASF, and visit canolaschool.com.
I'm Lindsay Smith from RealAgriculture.com. Join me Monday nights for The Agronomists, a 1-hour live and interactive show broadcast across YouTube, Facebook, and X. Monday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern, I host expert agronomists from all over the country to give you answers to some of the toughest agronomic questions. Join us live or catch the replay Tuesday morning. That's The Agronomists with me, Lindsay Smith, Monday nights live at 8 p.m. Eastern.
One of the diseases that wheat growers are hearing a lot about across the vast wheat growing areas of North America is stripe rust. And this one's a doozy. Now, we've been dealing with fusarium. We know about that, okay? That's a bad one in wheat, right? And again, the timing of that moisture during the flowering time is really critical. What about the danger of stripe rust? We're hearing it coming up from the United States, and growers are really concerned about this because there is big potential yield loss. We got to stay on top of it. So we talked to Dr. Kelly Turkington. He's based out of Lacombe. Let's hear what he had to say.
Okay, so stripe rust, what are growers looking at this year in the West?
Actually, so far, a bit of good news. With stripe rust, typically the issue comes out of the States. So in terms of Alberta, it's primarily the Pacific Northwest, so Washington State, Oregon, and northwestern Idaho. And then central Saskatchewan into Manitoba is typically that Texas to Nebraska corridor. And this year, the stripe rust and leaf rust issues in the States are much, much less than last year. Last year in 2024, they started to show up quite early in the States, which meant there was more of a risk for the prairie region. This year, it's a pretty light epidemic so far, but it's something that you'd want to keep an eye on, especially if you're growing a variety of winter wheat or spring wheat or another class of wheat that is susceptible to stripe rust.
Right. So any recommendations how often growers should be out there scouting? What should they be looking for?
Well, a couple of things. So I'm involved with the Prairie Crop Disease Monitoring Network, and usually in about mid-May through to the start of July, we put out weekly rust risk forecasts for prairie producers. So we look at the epidemics in the States. Do we have epidemics of concern that could provide a source of rust spores that blow up into the prairie region? We look at wind trajectories and whether we've had trajectories that bring those spores up. Then we look at weather conditions and crop growth stage and issues those forecasts. So that's one thing growers can follow. But when they're out in the field, scouting, have a look at what's there. And unfortunately with the rusts, they can appear out of nowhere and develop quite rapidly. So if it's something that you're not routinely out in your field scouting, you may unfortunately miss it, at least at a stage where you could put a fungicide on and get a really high level of control. So the risk forecasts that the Prairie Crop Disease Monitoring Network provides is really just a heads up for growers and consultants to identify regions where there may be an emerging stripe rust or leaf rust problem and where they're encouraged to scout. And typically the rule of thumb is about 5% of the leaves affected or 5% of the area of the leaves affected. That's sort of a bit of a threshold, but if you're starting to see stripe rust early, a fungicide will be important, even at that herbicide timing, because fungicides tend to be much more effective against rusts versus some of the other leaf spots like tan spot or septoria complex or net blotch scald or spot blotch in barley.
Right, and you mentioned off camera that in the east some of the stripe rust overwintered. Is that fairly typical? What do growers need to think of with that?
It's certainly an interesting observation. They've noted it here over the last 2 weeks in Ontario. They had a big epidemic in 2024. And yes, if you have stripe rust moving into your winter wheat field in the fall and establishing on that winter wheat field, and then if the winter is mild, so you get good snow cover, good insulation, and the temperatures are not overly cold, that stripe rust can overwinter. And we've seen it in central Alberta, in research plots and in commercial fields. In mid-April, we saw active stripe rust starting to develop. So that was about 2015, I think. So certainly if you have winter wheat and you notice stripe rust in the fall, and there's been an epidemic in the spring wheat crop that previous summer, I would be back out into that winter wheat field as soon as it's starting to regrow. See if you're seeing symptoms, and if you are, hit it with a fungicide. And then after about 3 weeks, you might actually have to go back in again and look at topping that fungicide up.
And should growers be going to report any stripe rust findings that they're seeing, or how does that work?
Absolutely. That's part of the Prairie Crop Disease Monitoring Network, is the network of people. That involves researchers, extension staff, individual farmers, crop consultants. If they see some things, let us know, because then we can provide that information sort of broadly across the prairie region. So it's just a heads up that things are starting to occur, because the summer's busy. And if you're a consultant and you have a number of clients, depending on what's happening, you may be run off your feet. So a little bit of a heads up regarding emerging issues might mean that you transition to scouting for leaf diseases, let's say, versus insects or weeds.
That was Dr. Kelly Turkington, based out of Lacombe. Since I started Real Agriculture going back to 2008, Kelly has been a staple when it comes to diseases in cereal crops. Does great work. Really one of the treasures of our research and academic industry within agriculture. Okay, you know what? Hey, this weekend, the G7. Yeah, coming to Kananaskis. I couldn't think of a more beautiful spot. Really. Like, think about it. If you're going to hold a meeting, and here's the other thing. I'll tell us to anybody that will listen. One of the best, if you are a fan of the old-fashioned that is made at the Kananaskis Lodge, it is elite. It is elite. It's a little bit different because they put a little dabble of some maple syrup in there. And you're at first glance, when you first hear it, you're sort of like, whoa, I don't know about this. And then you taste it and you're like, where you been all my life? So it is fantastic. Kananaskis provides some of the most gorgeous scenery that one can imagine. And for somebody that grew up very close to the Rocky Mountains, you kind of get desensitized. If you lived in Paris, you'd be desensitized to like the Eiffel Tower, Versailles. If you lived in London, it's like, yeah, whatever. It's the London Bridge. It's Big Ben. Who cares, right? This is like human condition, what we all do. But the views are spectacular when it comes to that. Is Kananaskis is Canada on a postcard. Curious what the outcomes are of some of the most powerful leaders across the world coming to Alberta. What's a good outcome for the G7? Not a blow-up. Not the same repeat performance that we had last time when it was in Quebec, when they couldn't agree on the communique, and then Trump and Trudeau had words. This is Carney's real. Obviously his coming out party was at the White House. He performed very well there a week after he became prime minister. But I would say this is a big test for him. He's going to want to have good relations coming out of this, or continue with good relations with the United States. They're of course working on this rumored deal between the two countries. He invited Modi, president of India, to the meeting. That's created some controversy amongst the Sikh community in Canada. But obviously Carney is trying to iron out a repaired relationship post-Trudeau with India. There's a lot to... You know what? And maybe if nothing comes of all this, maybe that's the best case scenario indeed. Hey, check out RealAgriculture.com. And until next weekend, this is Shaun Haney for RealAgriculture.com.